Okay, hello. So my name is Nye Parry. I work in music, I suppose, and sound art, and I work in the university and at the Guildhall College of Music, and I'm a composer, and I've been playing gamelan since my student days, where I studied at York. Do you want me to look at you, or do you want me to look at the camera? Look at the red light. I'm telling a red light story. You can cut all of that out. I started playing gamelan as an undergraduate at York in, I suppose, the beginning of 1985. I started as a student in 84, but I think I wasn't allowed to touch the gamelan until 1985 because they were rehearsing for a big concert when I arrived in, which was in Como in Italy. So they were all going off to Italy, and new people had to wait for that. So I started, I remember the very first meeting with Neil Sorrell. There was a whole bunch of people who were interested who met. It was a big group actually, and not everyone joined. And Neil was a very charismatic character, and I think everybody was quite sort of taken with him telling us about the gamelan. So we were all very disappointed when we then weren't actually allowed to start for a few months. But I started at the same time as Maria Mendonça, who's made quite a career out of gamelan, and various other people, Joe Hoskins. She started a year later, I think, maybe 2, yeah. And there's still quite a lot of people from those days around. John Pawson was already playing in that group. Smith was playing in that group. Isabel Carré had just finished, and she just left that group. So the group was probably about 2 or 3 years old when I joined it.
All of them were students there?
So they were all students at York, yeah.
And so you learned the gamelan at the time because you were a student? It was part
yes,
of the curriculum?
it wasn't really part of the curriculum, and in fact it became a departmental. I'm going to look at you, I'm not going to look at this red light, sorry. It's much better. It became an official ensemble while I was there, and everybody had to do an official ensemble. So but when it became an official ensemble, that meant that a lot of the composers joined the group because they weren't playing, or people who didn't play orchestral instruments and didn't join the orchestra. It was one of the options for them. But when I started, it wasn't even considered worthy by the university of being an official ensemble yet. So we had to do another one, so I did the choir as well. So really it was out of interest. It was, I have to say my parents had lived in Singapore, and my father has a small collection of wayang puppets and had bought them in Singapore, and they're very old and very dusty, and so I had a sort of vague notion, but I hadn't really associated any music with those puppets. I knew about the puppets, and but I didn't know about the music. I'd never heard a gamelan, I don't think, until I was at York. So, but I was sort of brought up. I'd been to concerts of Indian music and things, and I was sort of brought up in a environment that was interested in theatre forms from different countries and things like that. So I was sort of, the sort of person who probably would go, oh, there's something interesting here that's a music that I don't know. But I really didn't know about gamelan until I started. And I think that was the case. I remember there was somebody in the group in that first meeting said, is it a Balinese gamelan or a Javanese gamelan? And I kind of went, ooh, I say, that's a very intelligent question. I wouldn't know anything about that. So there were a few people who sort of knew a little bit about gamelan, joined the group, but basically we were all ignorant.
But you didn't know anything about gamelan. What was really inspired you to go there to learn gamelan? Is it something?
Well, like I say, I was inspired by the idea that there was some kind of music being taught that I didn't know anything about, I think, was for me. Obviously, once I started, I was, we went to concerts. There was a Balinese group that came to Leeds, and we all went to Leeds to hear them. And we did do an academic project at some stage. I think I did it in my first year or possibly my second year, where we looked at different forms of gamelan and studied a bit more kind of academically. But really, it was the playing group. So it was And then, of course, when the South Bank got their gamelan, we all came down in a minibus to the all-night wayang that was the inaugural thing in what's now what was the People's Palace. It's now the Skylon or something restaurant, which I found out only this weekend because Zaxis went and he texted me to say, I've been to the Skylon. What the hell? Anyway, so it was in that big space, and it was a wonderful, wonderful event because there was a lot of Indonesian food, and there was, it was an all-night wayang, so there was a great sort of sense of occasion, and lots of people from the embassy there, and lots of people dressed up in the sort of full garb, and it was the first time I'd seen anything like that. I have to say, at this stage, that I didn't go to Bali or Java until we went as a group, three or four years ago with Lila Cita. I never went there to study. I thought about it at various points in my there was one point when I was living in Yorkshire, near York, and I'd been playing, and I sort of left the job that I was doing, and I was sort of at a bit of a loose end, and that was when Pete Smith went to Java, and I think I wasn't really as interested in Javanese music as some people were. I think it was when I then looked at Balinese gamelan, when we got the Angklung, that I sort of got re-enthused. I was playing Javanese, and I loved Javanese music, and I'm very interested in the theory, but I wouldn't be interested enough to spend a year studying it. And I have to say that always, for me personally, and this might not be relevant, but I think there are players who discovered gamelan, and that then becomes the only music for them. It becomes it sort of dominates their lives. Mm-hmm. Whereas for me, I've always been primarily interested in gamelan as part of my musical experience as a Western musician. So I've always been quite interested in new music for gamelan. I've always been quite interested in, because I'm a composer, I suppose I've been interested in how the structures might work and be reinterpreted in Western music theory. And I'm primarily an electroacoustic composer, so I work with studio technologies and found sounds and things. And I suppose there's not a very direct influence of gamelan on that, but I've always sort of interpreted my playing gamelan as part of my musical life here, more than something that has to do with the place that gamelan originated. Although I'm obviously very interested and enjoy going to wayang and going to see dance and things. It's not the primary thing. The primary thing is my involvement and the chance to play in a group, I suppose, because I grew up as a piano player and a guitar player, and I didn't really play in large ensembles. I didn't play in an orchestra, so it's that. And I've always had problems with notation, and so it's really lovely to play music that is highly structured and highly composed and yet doesn't involve notation. Historically, British gamelan, there has been a battle about notation. In my experience, there have been people who have insisted on using notation all the way through. And there have been people who've insisted on not using notation. And one of the great things about when we went to Bali was it totally changed our attitude to notation. Because I think the people who were using notation, because we learnt the pieces so well and played the places again and again, it ended up that nobody needed it. And then everybody realised why you shouldn't have it because of that. And there are people who still use it from time to time within our group, within Lila Cita. But it's a very different way that they use it. They use it just as a way of sort of vaguely remembering something. They'll look it up before they play, and then they'll play without it, or they'll write something down to take away and think about and take away and learn. But there's very, very little sitting there following this business that used to go on a lot. Only really goes on in my piece now, and it goes on much, much less in my piece. And I loved that we managed to actually memorise that for Bali, but my piece is the piece I wrote for Lila Cita, which I suppose I should talk about a little bit, is unusual in that it's got lots of independent parts. So you can't follow anybody else. There are sections where everybody is playing something completely different from everybody else, almost. And so that's why some people still need to follow that if they haven't been playing it for that long and things like that. Which I kind of regret, but I really do still like the sound of that happening. And it's a sort of, in terms of composing for gamelan, I feel that I'm not interested in composing Balinese music for gamelan, because I'm not Balinese. I'm interested in composing my music for gamelan.
Because they're contemporary Balinese gamelan.
Well, it's Balinese gamelan, because the instruments it uses are Balinese gamelan. It draws on Balinese gamelan music. It draws on my knowledge of it, which is not great. It's not Manny's knowledge. It's not Andy's knowledge. It's my knowledge of it, but it comes from 20 years, 25 years of playing different types of gamelan. So there is a sense that I feel almost more at home with those instruments than I would. Certainly not writing for a Western orchestra. I would have to look up a lot more than I do for writing for a Balinese gamelan. But I feel that it's music that, it comes from me and my cultural background as much, if not more than. There's no attempt to sort of pretend to be Balinese in any way. And I find music that is too close to the Indonesian model. Especially music for Javanese gamelan that's sort of takes too much. I find quite difficult often, because I think it sort of misses the point a bit of why one might want to. Often I can see slightly pained looks on the Javanese musicians who are involved, because they think actually it doesn't really work as Javanese music. Or there are composers I'm thinking of which I shouldn't.
Have you ever composed on Javanese gamelan?
I have composed for Javanese gamelan twice. Once, as a student, I wrote a piece that we never even tried to play, and it was just an academic exercise. It was just to get some extra points for a project, and then I wrote a piece for the festival that had a ridiculously long title. And the title was a bit of a joke. It was called what was it called? The libido, freed from the external world, turns towards the ego to obtain imaginary satisfaction for Javanese gamelan and tape. And it was a line from a book by Wim Mertens on minimal music that interpreted it in a strange sort of French philosophical way. And I just thought it was a silly line, so I'd use it as a title.
But you ever performed it?
We did. We performed it very badly at the Striking Out Festival at York, which was a festival of British gamelans that was organised at York, I guess, in 1996 or 5, maybe. No, probably before that, 94 maybe. I'm sure somebody who you talk to will remember when it was, especially if you talk to Neil, who was the sort of driving force behind it. It wasn't just British. There were people like Jodie Diamond came over, and Larry Polanski, and I think a few other people came over. I think Pat Jocko was still at York or around, but I might be wrong there. No, I might be wrong. But it was a great get together of all the gamelans that there were at the time, which wasn't that many actually. A lot of groups from London went up, which meant that a lot of us, who were in those days very keen, played in almost all the groups. So we played in the sort of, I think it was, which version of the contemporary music groups that were, I think it was Thrawana, which was sort of Adrian Lee's group that was playing, which we used to play in London on the instruments that were commissioned by the National Theatre for the production of the Midsummer Night's Dream that Robert Lepage did at the National Theatre. And he commissioned this black gamelan that belongs to the National Theatre.